by putting different people with different perspectives into a room and getting them to talk actually gives you a chance of making progress compared to the more traditional approach of policy making, where rich and powerful people get to meet ministers behind closed doors and stitch up deals.
Hello and welcome to Michelson Alexander Explains. I'm Communications Specialist Matilda Finn, and today we're speaking to our Special Advisor and former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration, Abul Rizvi, about the key takeaways from the Jobs and Skills Summit held in Canberra last week. Abul, welcome.
Thanks, Matilda.
So Abul, you attended and spoke at day 2 of the Jobs and Skills Summit last week. So can you tell us what it was like attending the summit?
It was an extraordinarily positive vibe, I have to say. I mean, whilst there were many people there from unions and many people there from the employer bodies who generally have a pretty poor history at getting on, they were all very well behaved. And I suspect one of the reasons was that around 50% of the attendees at the summit were women. And, you know, blokes, when they're with other blokes, tend to not behave very well. But when there are women around, they tend to sort of pull up their socks a bit and are a bit more polite. And so there was a feeling of trying to get on. And I think there was a feeling of, let's see if we can do the best for Australia. Having said that, look, let's not be under any illusions. When the time came, the employer and the union bodies went back into their corners and said what you'd expect them to say.
So can you tell us who were the most notable attendees and speakers at the summit?
So the Prime Minister, of course, opened the summit and closed the summit. The Treasurer had a major role. I think at the IR session we had Tony Burke. The IR session was in fact chaired by my daughter Abul Rizvi, which was a very proud moment for me. That was great. Then there were a number of other sessions that were chaired by other ministers, including Brendan O'Connor, Jenny McAllister. On the second day, we had the immigration sessions, and they were chaired by the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles.
Well, the youngest participant in the Jobs Summit was 23-year-old youth advocate Yasmin Poole, who expressed the sentiment that young people were finally being heard at the summit, particularly around issues of gender and inequality. She said, and I'm going to quote her here, "I've heard gender mentioned in every single panel. It was powerful to hear words like gender lens, disability and First Nations being used frequently. It feels like optimism, but also inclusion, not just something tokenistic, but a willingness to change deeper structure that often drives inequality." So from your own experiences at the summit, do you think great progress was made on issues of gender, equality, and maybe even things like parental leave?
The feeling at the summit was very much that things needed to be done to address the gender pay gap, to address the issues of people with disabilities, First Nations people being able to access employment in an equitable manner. I think there was very strong support for that, and a number of the outcomes from the summit itself expressly pursue that. On the gender front, there was very much a view that the still relatively low participation rate of women in the Australian labour force is an ongoing problem, but it's also an enormous opportunity. The point was made. If we could just halve the gap between men and women in terms of labour force participation, the benefits to the economy would be huge. And against the background of a rapidly ageing population as we have, achieving a closing of that gap is really, really important.
One of the main takeaways to come out of the summit was the migration cap, which lifted the number of permanent migrants allowed into Australia to 195,000 to tackle the current jobs crisis. Treasurer Jim Chalmers also flagged the need for more investment in housing off the back of this announcement. Can you explain what this announcement actually means for Australia and our current immigration policies?
So the cap was increased from 160,000 to 195,000. Two important things about that increase. It is highly likely a substantial portion of the increase will actually go to people who are temporary residents in Australia and have been temporary residents in Australia for some time. Now that is good policy to provide them with a pathway to permanent residence. But we need to be clear, converting them from temporary residents to permanent residents does not add to the labour force. Luckily also doesn't add to housing demand. The second thing about the increase of the cap, and this hasn't been reported much in the media, is that almost all of the increase will have to be driven by individual state and territory governments nominating the skilled migrants they want. So that'll be the first step. People will have to apply to get state and territory nomination, and if their characteristics, particularly their occupations, align with the needs of that particular state, they will then be nominated by that state. They'll be able to apply for formal migration with the Home Affairs Department, and then they will get a visa. Now, if you're offshore presently and going through that process, it is highly unlikely you will arrive in Australia within the next 6 to 9 months. So if we're saying that the increase in the cap will help us with our immediate labour shortages, it won't. What is going to be far more significant in the short term in terms of labour shortages generally, not necessarily skill shortages, is what's happening with students. Students have come back with a vengeance. The numbers are going up at rates I have never seen, and I've been watching the numbers for students for over 35 years. I've never seen the numbers like this. In July alone, there was a net increase in students in Australia of 50,000. 50,000 in a month is a big number. The number of offshore student visa applications received in June and July outstripped any June and July in our history. So students, frankly, are the main game.
So actually following on from that point, you spoke at day 2 of the summit touching on Australia's history of exploitative migrant labour and mistreatment that has led to many Pacific Island farm workers fleeing their employers. You also described how many migrants, including international students, as you just said, are at risk of being stuck in immigration limbo, saying they live permanently in the shadows. So what solutions did you offer in your speech for the greater protection of migrant workers, particularly with this huge wave of foreign students arriving?
The exploitation of low-skill migrant guest workers in particular, whether they are on a visa or not, both in Europe and North America for the last 30 to 40 years, has been nothing short of appalling. As a proud migrant nation, we should not want to go down that path. Yet, for the last 10 years, the things that we have done have taken us down that path. We are starting to look more and more like America and Europe in terms of the exploitation of migrant guest workers. Now, the government says it doesn't want us to become a guest worker society. Frankly, too late. We have become a migrant guest worker society. Now, it's good to minimise the number of people in that immigration limbo, but we're not going to eliminate it. It's going to keep growing. The number of temporary entrants in Australia will keep growing. What we can do is look at what North America and Europe have tried to do in this space, because they have failed, and it's good to learn from failure. There's a lot to learn. Some of the good things they've done is strengthen their laws in this space. We can do that. They have provided increased resources to the regulators who enforce those laws. We too should do that. Those are both good things. But neither of those two things has ever effectively addressed the problem in North America or Europe. We need to think of something more innovative, and we know in the history of the human race, the organisations that have done the singularly best job in protecting workers are workers themselves and the people who organise them, that is, unions. What we should do in this space is recognise that. Now, I know a lot of people will go, talk about union thugs and all of that. That's just rhetoric and just silly stuff. If we can give unions a stronger role in this space, we have a chance of reducing the risk of these people being exploited for two reasons. One, unions have a much wider footprint than any regulator can ever have. And secondly, most of these migrant workers are very scared of officialdom. They don't like to go to government officials. But they will go to a trusted union person who they've known for some time. If they've known the person, they've got used to them, they will go to them if there's a problem. Those are the two reasons I believe unions can help us minimise the risk of us becoming like North America and Europe in this regard.
Did the unions have quite a strong voice at the Jobs and Skills Summit?
Yes, they did. There was, I think, about 30% of the people there were either with a union or had some affiliation with a union. And so there were strong voices in that regard. Having said that, there were actually more people representing business than there were unions. So when you hear in the media that it was a union love fest, well, actually there were more people from business there than from the unions.
So moving on to digital and tech skills, the Tech Council of Australia welcomed the outcomes of the summit as it made concrete progress towards achieving 1.2 million tech jobs by 2030. How does the Australian government plan to achieve this commitment?
So increasing the migration cap helps because a substantial portion of our tech workers come from overseas and have been coming from overseas for 30 years. So in that regard, it's not new. The larger program will help more of them come. That's great. More significantly, I think, though, the government recognised that tech workers don't just go to universities. Digital workers also attend TAFE. And I think the significant expansion of free TAFE places is going to be crucial in that regard, especially if those people can develop digital skills, and that's where they focus. The challenge, of course, will be where do we get enough digital teachers to teach all those TAFE kids?
Nationals leader David Littleproud suggested waiving the HECS debt for registered nurses working in aged care. And this could cost taxpayers more than $60 million. How was this suggestion received at the summit, and do you think it's likely to happen?
I thought it was received quite positively. I think overall Mr. Littleproud's contribution was quite positive. I think it would help attract more young people into studying nursing, but we shouldn't forget that a substantial part of our problem in terms of a shortage of nurses is being able to retain them once they've completed their courses. Frankly, what we pay nurses and the conditions under which we make them work are unacceptable. And as our population and the population of all developed nations around the world ages significantly, there will be intense competition for nurses, registered nurses around the world. If we don't pay our nurses enough, somebody else will pay them more.
So finally, Abul, what do you think was the biggest lesson out of the summit for businesses and not-for-profits?
I think the biggest lesson for everybody was that by putting different people with different perspectives into a room and getting them to talk actually gives you a chance of making progress compared to the more traditional approach of policy making, where rich and powerful people get to meet ministers behind closed doors and stitch up deals.
Well, that's all we've got time for today. Abul, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights from the Jobs and Skills Summit. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Matilda. Good to talk.
Make sure you like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.